So I'm going to introduce Kathleen Dull, who's one of the librarians and archivists for the Fray Angelico Chavez History Library at the New Mexico History Museum. She previously worked at the Library Services Coordinator for the University of New Mexico's Health Sciences Library, as an adult services librarian at Albuquerque Public Library, and a manager at Rio Rancho Public Libraries. She has her MLIS and Certificate of Rare Books and Special Collections from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a BA in Psychology from Macalester College, St. Paul, Minnesota, which she needs to work on the Harvey weekend, for sure. This is her fourth Harvey weekend, and Kathleen's going to do a couple things. And Kathleen and I are in touch most of the year over a lot of different things, having to do with the Harvey weekend, having to do with the Steve Wimmer Project, which you're going to learn about. So I want to tell you, one, she's going to talk about the Steve Wimmer Southwest Research Fund. How many of you already know about this? Some of the new people won't, so she will explain who Steve Wimmer was and why, when I showed his picture yesterday, I started weeping, and a little bit about the project and this year's winner. And she's going to give a different kind of talk. So normally when we invite people to give a talk here, we expect them to be the world's expert on their subject. One of the things about Southwest Detours is that there are a lot of people who know something about it, and even the woman who wrote the one book about it knew something about it, but there's not been a lot of new research on the Southwest Indian Detours, which I think we all agree is a landmark thing for Santa Fe, for New Mexico, for tourism, for women, for lots of different things. So what Kathleen is going to give you is sort of a librarian's tour of the materials that we realize are out there for you to take in and think about and jump into. And my favorite part of all this is that this partly got instigated because Denny Dickinson, if you were here a couple years ago, he's the one who found the Cassidy painting, charcoal, of the Indian Detours opening. And so one of the endless questions that those of us in Fred area have, there's this book that came out in 1978 called The Southwest Indian Detours. It's got a yellow cover. The author is long deceased. And she knew everything about the Southwest Indian Detours, and we were all told that all her materials were gone. The stories that I was told was that they were sold at a garage sale at her house in Arizona. But these are the kinds of stories you hear about Harvey materials that people can't find. And what we find is a lot of things that are gone forever turn out to not be gone forever. So one day Denny sends me this email, and he says, I have found Diane Thomas's notes and all her research for the Southwest Indian Detours book. It's in Wyoming, at a historical place in Wyoming. And I called Kathleen to tell her this, and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do about this. And she said, oh, I have a day off next week. My mom and I are going to drive up there. And she went up and she documented all this stuff, and what she spent a lot of time doing over the past months is digitizing materials that somebody who wants to dive into the Southwest Indian Detours in just a deeper way about the women, about what they said, about the artwork, about the typography. I mean, everything about the Detours was really cool and interesting, and we don't know enough about it. So she's going to give a librarian's tour through the materials, a different kind of talk, that I hope one day soon will lead to somebody who becomes the next great expert on the Detours to come and do that for us. So that's how we sort of pass it on here. So Kathleen's going to give you present our Wimmer Award, and then give her talk. Kathleen Dull, thank you.
So, as some of you may know and some of you may not, Steve Wimmer was the head concierge at the La Fonda, and a few years away, he passed unexpectedly. And thanks to Stephen and his very generous spirit, he started the Steve Wimmer Southwest Research Fund to kind of capture Steve's really ebullience, just love of the Southwest and love of the La Fonda, love of Santa Fe, and just joy when people would come here, and he just really loved sharing this place with them. So we wanted to come up with a way to capture that and to keep it going. And one way that what we came up with was sort of a three-pronged approach. Was that what we discovered was that a lot of the grants that are out there do not pay for travel. So they'll pay for a lot of other things, but one of the things that Steve was really all about was travel. So we wanted to have a fund that was a little bit different to kind of also reflect his personality. So we started the Steve Wimmer Southwest Research Fund, which gives a stipend, which the recipient can use any way that they want. We really tried not to put very many restrictions on it because we don't know how sometimes funds can best be used. So many people can use it for travel, but maybe that can be used in other ways. Essentially, the recipient receives $1,000. Thanks to the generosity of Jenny and the La Fonda, they get up to 4 nights to stay there, which is pretty amazing. And then they get a week to research here at the library with our collections, which are, have to say, fairly phenomenal. I didn't have any part in putting them together, so I'm allowed to say that. So it's a pretty fun project. And then at the end of it, you write an article and get to share that. So last year we had Marcy Botwick, who was here to talk about the Bloom and Shine women, in case you were there for that. Her article came out in El Palacio, I believe, in the spring. So if you missed her, you can still catch her article. The Bloom and Shine archives are here in the library, and a lot of that emphasis for that family is on Ernest. However, the ladies are in there as well. So it was very fun to see that original research come forth from this fund. It is available to any scholar, so you can be, sort of an official academic scholar associated with an institution or more of an amateur or armchair historian. We focus on people researching from 1879 to 1949, focusing on the Southwest, and you need to research something that's at the library. So if you want to research something held by someone else, I totally support you in that, just not with these funds. So, sorry. For year one, we had 3 applicants, and they were excellent candidates, and we selected one from there. But for this year, we had 14. And I have to say that the review sessions got a little difficult. We had some really, really wonderful candidates. And it came, we have such a wonderful recipient that I'm about to introduce to you. But we are at a point where we are currently awarding only 1 award. So at some point, we hope to be able to award more than that. So you are the very first ones to hear this. The press release has not gone out yet. But this year's recipient is Dr. Peter Linder from Highlands, and I'm so excited he's going to tell you about his research.
Thanks very much. Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, I am a university professor, so that's a lie. I just want to express my gratitude first to Kathleen, who I've been in contact with since last year. I applied last year with a somewhat different project and was gratified, even though I wasn't the recipient, and actually Kathleen helped me out personally with some information that she was able to provide. And in fact, what I was working on last year kind of folds into this project in a number of ways. Again, my name is Peter Linder. I'm originally from Los Alamos, and I've been at Highlands for going on 27 years now. Before that, I did my undergraduate, my master's at University of New Mexico, working primarily with Edwin Lewin, who was a Latin American historian, and I am by training primarily a Latin Americanist. And then I went on to the University of Texas at Austin, where I did my doctorate in Latin American history, and I started out as a Venezuelanist. When I was hired at Highlands back in 1997, I was hired sort of as a kind of multitasking historian. At Highlands, I teach all the Latin American classes, but also New Mexico history, Southwest history, Western Civ, historiography, and occasionally fun things like history through film. But my primary research focus has been on the history of Venezuela. Initially, I was working in the late 19th, early 20th century. As it's become more difficult to do research in Venezuela, I've had to sort of retreat back in time because I can't get to the archives in Caracas or in Maracaibo anymore. I have to go to Spain. And so I've sort of reinvented myself as a kind of colonialist, although that's a process still underway. But what I found during my work in 19th and 20th century Venezuela was that there were a lot of things going on there for which I could find parallels in the history of New Mexico and the Southwest. In some ways, some of the same issues and preoccupations about modernity and modernization, and about the interplay between capital investment and the impact cultural and otherwise on society. And most of my work has been around Lake Maracaibo in the western part of Venezuela. But for about a decade and a half now, I've been working in New Mexico history, and in particular in my own corner of New Mexico in Las Vegas. And one of the things that I find is that Las Vegas is an endlessly fascinating community. And it's got a lot going for it in terms of the study of history. Now, the brilliant presentation which I'm following, and again, a tough act to follow, talked about the Harvey Girls and the idea that the Harvey Girls were in some ways harbingers or bringers of civilization. And what I'm planning to research on, and I've been working on this topic for a number of years, is another group of women, single women, who come to New Mexico at precisely this same time. And what I'm talking about here are Protestant missionaries. Now, there's been some work on Protestant missionaries or missionary women. Cheryl Martin's book, for example, on women of the, focusing on the women of the territorial period, talks about missionary wives. But one of the things that most fascinated me when I started into this topic was that some of the Protestant denominations brought women, single women, from the East or from the Midwest as missionaries. In particular, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and to a lesser degree, the Presbyterian Church, had single women come as missionary teachers. And they operated mission schools in Las Vegas, in Albuquerque, in Farmington, working to try to evangelize, but also acculturate indigenous people and Hispanics. And this was sponsored by the Methodist Episcopal Church in particular, through its Women's Home Missionary Society, which was founded under the auspices of Rutherford B. Hayes' wife. And they came and they were an integral part of Las Vegas society and the Society of Albuquerque, and were engaged in kind of culturally transformative activities. And so what I'm proposing to research is the impact of these women. Because they intervened in a lot of areas. They were teachers, they were missionaries, they were also proponents of things like the women's Christian temperance movement. Sometimes they aroused public ire, especially among the Hispanic community. So again, that's what I'm going to be working on this year. And again, I just want to thank everyone who was involved for the opportunity. And I think I've talked longer than I should have, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
So, some of the other things that the fund does, as Dr. Linder mentioned, we did some digitization, much to my amusement, and I would hope Steve's, is that one of the collections was the Women's Temperance collection. I hope he enjoyed his memory help funding that digitization. And then also one of the other things that we did was make a purchase for the collection. And in 2021, one of the purchases that we made was a copy of the Southwest Indian Detours, which was great. We got it from a local bookseller, and it said that it was signed by 18 of the surviving Harvey Girls. I was a bit confused. But okay, I was going with it. He said it was a great book, and there are lovely signatures, but I was not sufficiently aware at that time why the Harvey Girls would be signing an Indian Detours book, and thankfully we have solved the mystery. I would like to welcome you to the most distinctive motor cruise service in the world. It is so wonderful to see so many returning friends, and a very warm welcome to all of the new faces, and I hope to see you again next year. So, as Stephen mentioned, I don't know if you were able to attend last year, but our world expert on Gerald Cassidy, Mr. Dennis Dickinson, was instrumental in getting the Gerald Cassidy charcoal painting, or charcoal artwork, from the Museum of Art. We rolled it across Lincoln for one afternoon, and it was here. And then our collections teams for both museums were so great and rolled it back across Lincoln on the one slightly sprinkly day in the fall. But he, I think, has every librarian in the city on retainer and is indefatigable in his quest for finding every bit of Gerald Cassidy information. And through working with Valerie Nye at the Santa Fe Community College, somehow she found the box on Diane Darnell Thomas in Laramie, Wyoming, at the University of Wyoming at the American Heritage Center. So she found the box. It was very exciting. But I found the online description. The entire collection description was 3 sentences. And it said things like, it has a manuscript in it. And I thought, yes, I hope so, but that is not necessarily terribly descriptive. So we didn't know what was in the collection. And as Stephen mentioned, I mean, what do you do? Do you try to find a researcher there? Do you try to get them to tell you what's in the box? Like, what do you do? So my mother was visiting. We had Juneteenth off. They are open on Juneteenth, and I said, Mom, get in the car. So we had a lovely stay at the Castaneda on the way up. I told them I was coming. I go in, here we go. There is no box. For a very, very nerve-wracking 20 minutes, they couldn't find the box. They found the box. We're very, very grateful. So, as also Stephen mentioned, in the past almost 90 years, this is the only book on this topic, and she wrote it 50 years later. So 50 years after people had this one job when they were generally in their 20s, and I'm sure taking great notes. And so she was basing it on recollections and like half memories that contradicted the guy from next door. Names got conflicted and other things got conflicted, and then she just wrote it down, and she had a very loose relationship with citations. So she wanted it to read like fiction. So she was a freelance journalist, and so she wanted it to be very readable. So she just thought that if it was too well cited, that would, take down its entertainment factors, which left us with a lot of questions like, well, where did that come from? As a librarian and someone who really, really appreciates when names are spelled consistently, that was a little bit trying, but she's the only one that wrote the book. So on one hand, slightly frustrating. On the other hand, what if she hadn't? So very, very grateful. The picture in the middle is the one box. This is it. A lot of it, like approximately half, is copies. And they're copies of a lot of things that we have here in the library. But a lot of it is also correspondence. And that's really, really wonderful. But my favorite envelope is one from her publisher, who you'd think would not need to write this. However, it says, "This is about the Southwest Indian Detours, whatever they were." I've never written a book, but if I do, I hope my publisher doesn't feel the need to add that. So before we get too far down here, let's maybe review what they were. So the Indian Detours was a touring business with the headquarters in Santa Fe. Although the business continued in one form or another into the 1950s, its heyday was in the late 1920s to 1930s, And this talk focuses on the very beginning, basically 1926 to 1931. The excursions were motor car trips throughout the Southwest, designed to give the cross-country travelers on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway an adventurous interlude away from the railroad, which was the only practical way for most people to get from coast to coast. The original tours were confined to north-central New Mexico, but by 1929, a Detours car could be hired, complete with chauffeur and a courier, for about $100 to go almost anywhere in the Southwest where a reasonable trail could be discerned. You can decide what you feel that means. So, this story, I will argue, really begins with a woman. Many of you might know Erna Ferguson as the very august New Mexico's First Lady of Letters. But before she was a distinguished writer, she was very proudly the only Lady Dude Wrangler. She was born in Albuquerque. She went to Columbia for her master's, which she received in 1913, and then she returned to run the Red Cross in New Mexico during World War I. In that capacity, she traveled all throughout the state, which must have just been a whole nother thing at the time. And then upon the end of the war, she was really enamored with that travel. And she wanted to show people the state and started a touring company with Ethel Hickey, her business partner. They were based in Albuquerque and eventually opened a branch office in the Franciscan Hotel in Santa Fe. It's pretty easy to tell which one she is in the photos because she's wearing pants. I really appreciate that. So the business they started was the Cochari Tours, which is the Pueblo Indian word meaning delight maker. And part of their promotional material says that for the price of a good dinner for half a dozen people, we'll give you enough conversational food for a dozen dinners in any company. So they really established the template for the future tours. They had educated, well-informed female guides, a driver. They did day trips as well as up to 3-day excursions. And from the beginning, their guests were referred to as dudes. I still can't bring myself to do it, but. And Erna got all of the press. So Ethel taught at UNM, but she's almost impossible to find. So she shows up very, very briefly. You can tell from the booklet in the last slide, here it is. This is a picture from a promotional window in Atlantic City in 1924. So they were getting promoted across the country, even as earlier as that. So that's sort of half the story. The other half the story is that Hunter Clarkson was a major in World War I. After the war, where he served with distinguish, he returned to Scotland, and now this is one of my favorite pub stories. So he was in a Glasgow pub, he'd bought a farm, he was at the pub one night, and he met a man who was a liquor salesman, who asked why he didn't come to the US, and if he would, that he would get Clarkson a job with the Harvey Company. So he did. He came over, he went to the Grand Canyon, and he went to work for Harvey. And he was in charge of transportation, which was mules and wagons. And he fell in love with the boss's daughter. Isn't that sweet? So he falls in love with A.G. Wells, who was the vice president of passenger traffic, and her name was Louise. And they marry. Presumably they fall in love, and then they marry. And their first child is born in 1929, but they moved to the La Fonda. So he's the dashing one in the middle. I mean, don't you love it? So he puts together his team. He's at the La Fonda. They had done excursions around the Grand Canyon, but nothing sort of as developed as what Erna had going on. So instead of just reinventing the wheel, they buy the wheel. So they they buy Ernest's company and they bring her on as the consultant because it's just easier. So they purchased Koshari Tours and Ernest the consultant. The gentleman above her is R.W. Birdseye. Of his brother was the guy who came up with the frozen food fame. I know, right? They were very good at their pursuits. So they take the Koshari Tours and they sprinkle the Harvey magic on it. And aren't they beautiful? And they come up with this marketing. We refer to the one on the right as the mansplainer. Right? And so they start promoting the Indian Detours. And the maiden voyage, so that it's getting ready to go. There's a new way to go from coast to coast. And the first one leaves Las Vegas in a Packard 8 touring car on May 15th, 1926. And it goes from Las Vegas to Santa Fe over Glorieta Pass, which frankly I can't really imagine, but they did it. And they decide eventually to be based out of Santa Fe. The cars were custom-made Packards and Cadillacs. And the Cadillacs would go for thousands of miles with almost no maintenance, while the Packards were constantly breaking down. Right? So you can decide which one the mechanics and drivers would prefer. And that is the extent of my vehicular knowledge. So this is another Gerald Cassidy. This is a brochure that they would hand out. And isn't it beautiful? My favorite one is this lightning snake guy on the left. And then inside, they have some maps of the La Fonda and the Courier Lounge. So it's all, around sort of the inside patio. That is sort of the hub of the complete information on interesting things to do and see roundabout Santa Fe and throughout the Southwest. So they had courier car motor service for regular and special Indian detours, and are also car rental service information. So I think that would be a rather intrepid trip if you were not from here, but apparently you could rent a car. And then here was the Indian Lecture Lounge for the evening talks. So those were informal evening talks, illustrated with slides and moving pictures on various things of Southwestern interest. And this is it's part of a menu, and we have like the original down in the library. But they would like you to know that they are romantically situated in the most interesting 100 square miles of America. And that was a phrase that they used on a lot of maps. So we've got somewhere to base out of, which is excellent, and we've got the ladies in charge. So, the rules for the couriers were slightly different than the Harvey Girls. They were 25 to 35 with college degrees, not negotiable. But you could be married, totally fine. And in the sort of their work description, they said, a well-developed sense of humor is a very valuable asset. The work is arduous, the hours seldom regular, and in dealing with the great American public, everything does not run on oiled wheels, no matter how effective organization may be. Those blessed with qualities of initiative, leadership, and tranquility under all circumstances find the work congenial and fascinating in its scope. No, not a heavy lift there. Originally, there were 3 couriers, and then they expanded to 6, and then they had to keep expanding out. And there were some questions earlier about their outfits. So, Erna Ferguson had many fine qualities. Fashion was not one of them. The original outfits were so ugly that one of the courier's mothers banned her from coming into her dress shop. So, Thankfully, Erna knew her limits, so when one of the couriers came to her and proposed the one that we know of as the courier outfit, she was amenable to like adjusting her requirements. But one of the reasons they were so colorful is that they needed to be seen on the train platforms. So they needed to be seen out of the whole sea of travelers. So that's part of the reason we get such great colors. They did get to wear pants. So that was great. So, you know, if you're climbing around on ladders, like in the ruins, pants really help. So along with the couriers, we need some drivers. And originally, they were not allowed to date. But Kay Montgomery went to Mr. Clarkson and told him that, as today, there weren't many available singles in Santa Fe. And the drivers were all decent men, and the couriers were nice girls, and you should let them date. And Clarkson did. He changed the rules. And that's why so many of them got married. I know. And they did. A lot of them got married. But really, I mean, if you're going to travel around and you don't have anybody else to talk to, I mean, you might as well. So now we're going to get into just a touch on just briefly what the detours looked like. So your job, as was theirs, is to succumb to the inevitable enchantment of the Southwest as quickly as possible. We are on deadline. So we have springtime in the plaza, and then an automobile on a mountain road. I like to think that they're up at Aspen Vista, although that looks slightly treacherous. All right, so we're going to go left to right on all of these. La Bajada, coming down from Santa Fe to Albuquerque, and then the Rio Grande Valley from the Santa Clara Pueblo. We have potters at the Santa Clara Pueblo and at San Ildefonso, up at Tesuque, and then the Red River Gorge, the church at Rinconada, and an adobe home at Santa Cruz. And then one of the taglines that they used was the roads to yesterday. So here's a horse and buggy inside Canyon de Chelly. So the Pouillet Cliffs are on the left, and one of the questions asked of the couriers was, why did they build them so far from the railroad? And then Bandelier is on the right. And, you know, they didn't have the infrastructure that they have now at Bandelier, and so there wasn't a road. So in order to get an automobile to the bottom, they drove it to the top, they took it apart, they lowered it in pieces to the bottom and put it all together again, because then the tourists didn't have to walk once they got to the bottom. Aztec ruins are on the left, and Chaco is on the right. And then the church at Ranchos de Taos. Isn't it pretty? So we've been out on some detours. They are 1, 2, and 3 days. And people decide they like it. So we are now 4 detours. So they start to add, you know, sort of more than the traditional day trips, which means dude ranches. Which is kind of like the interpretation of what a dude ranch possibly could have been, maybe. It's like the pretty version. So we have riders crossing the Rio Grande at Alcalde, and then Jack and Lois Lambert in Hidden Lake in Canjilon on the right. The horse corral in Canjilon, and then the trails party near San Gabriel Ranch in Alcalde over on the right. This is one of my favorites. They are shooting craps. She looks like she could give some advice, really. And the oldest cowboy on a bucking barrel. So who knows how they came up with this game, but it looks like some late night entertainment. They went to Inscription Rock and El Morro. So Mesa Verde had only been accessible from the north, but quote, "Now it belongs to the Santa Fe family of national parks," which I think is a great thing. Doesn't that sound fantastic? The new gateway and the quick way is to visit the Santa Fe Railway to Gallup, thence by auto stage. It's a 3-day round trip from Gallup, allowing 1 day in the park. The new motor road to the summit of the mesa affords unordinary views of the valley and snowy mountains as if from an aeroplane. So Carlsbad was only declared a national monument in 1923. So they were just at the beginning of taking tourists there, at the very, very beginning of the detours. So, quote, "Scarcely a year passes without the necessity of revising the list of the world's supreme natural marvels to give high place to some fresh entry from the silent hills and mountains of the Santa Fe Southwest. The Carlsbad Caverns are without peer among the famous caves of the world." And you can see, once again, we have these teeny, teeny, tiny figures here. And those were taken, the pamphlet art was taken from some of the trips that Erna took. And here she is in the middle. And these have been digitized and are online. They're in our photo archives collection, and they're really, really beautiful. Although now you see them like climbing around on things, and maybe not. Don't go reconstruct them, but they're really lovely photos. And not too long before it became a monument, they lowered guests down into the cavern in the guano bucket. So thankfully, there was some more infrastructure by the time they started taking the tourists here. One of the drivers was describing a trip of ladies whose husbands had decided to go on a fishing trip. And he just said that those same ladies decided they wanted to go to Carlsbad. So we took off, and it was hot. Coming back, they started to sing in the back seat. I turned my head, and they were sitting there dressed in slips and slugging gin out of flasks. They said it was too hot to wear their dresses. So we drove 270 miles across the Malpais Desert, getting noisier and hotter. So they did, this came out in about 2 to 3 years after they started, and they had gone 800,000 miles without an accident, which is kind of remarkable now. So they described, this is the precursor to the New Mexico magazine. At that time, it was the New Mexico Highway Journal, so we can forgive them being a little focused on the highway parts of things. But the booze was banned, proper signaling was demanded, and the buses were required to stop at railroad crossings. But then my next two favorite safety tips. The drivers were not allowed to smoke at the wheel. Many accidents are caused by the driver of a private car taking one or both hands off the wheel to light a cigarette, cigar, or pipe. And I just love imagining this in like the late 1920s. The driver of a Harvey car is not allowed to converse with passengers. It is claimed to be one of the most ordinary reasons for accidents. A driver to operate his vehicle safely must give all his attention to the road and no part of it to a conversation. So the dudes were always told beforehand that you can ask the courier because the driver needs to safely concentrate on his driving. And I just love that they had to ask the ladies because the men just couldn't possibly talk to them. And when the drivers drove so many miles, they would get a medallion in recognition of their safety. And one of those is on exhibit up at the top of the stairs. So by 1929, they have had so much success that by now they're getting parodied in the Chicago Tribune, which I just think is fantastic. So it's like a 2-page story that is entirely spoof. It's amazing. but I'll tell you about the girl guide and the driver. The Indian Detour Couriers are smart girls. A girl guide taking a party of inquisitive tourists on a sightseeing trip must have her geology, zoology, and languages right at her tongue's end. She must know enough about the geological formation to be able to point and say, "Look, that's a mountain." Harvey bus drivers are picked primarily, though you won't read about it in the folders, for their beautiful eyes. Impressionable ladies making the Indian trip for the first time will be very much intrigued. They will go home and remember the Harvey drivers' soulful eyes long after the Indians and the Pueblos and the Santa Clara pottery are forgotten. And they will get so upset that they will, 9 times out of 10, decide to make the Indian detour all over again. So now I have a treat from you from the Gustav Bauman Archive. And although we know him as a lithographer and a printmaker, he also had an illegal still and was, I think, probably a delight at a party. And he would come to the fiesta every year. I mean, he lived in town. And I was telling my colleague about this presentation, and just very offhandedly, she goes, "Well, you have the fiesta photos, right?" And I was like, "No." So she's digitized them for you, and since they have nothing to do with Gustav Bauman, no one's ever seen them before. So these are just for you. They have never, I think 3 people on the planet have seen these before today. And then the excerpts are from his autobiography. I was curious about the noisy hilarity that had taken possession of the plaza. When John Sloan's Harvey bus came along, I knew what had caused it. The bus was a lathe and muslin contraption 30 feet long with a red-headed boy as the radiator cap and to hold up the hood. The bus itself was filled with tourists who carried it suspended from shoulder straps. Large inner tubes hung from the sides for wheels. The signal for a punctured tire was a loud shot. The whole bus, passengers and all, would settle down while couriers climbed out to repair the tire. Nothing could be funnier. Whatever came after it was an anticlimax. The Harvey Company sold the business to the Clarksons in 1931. And at that point, the logo changes. So it goes from the Thunder Chicken, the traditional, first one, to the Eagle Dancers. So if you see something with an Eagle Dancer on it, it's after 31, and that's going to be the Clarkson Company. The topic goes entirely dormant until Diane, bless her heart, in almost 1980, when she decides to write the story. Her husband was one of the last people to take one of the Indian detours, and it's kind of just her love letter to him and his childhood memory, which is very, very kind. But that's it. That's what we've got until today. So thankfully, I am so grateful that the people who wrote to her presumably are correct in their own spelling of their name. So we have one confirmation of how we spell their names, and we can correct some of the others, and they all pretty much universally have really great handwriting. So even though there's a lot of typewriting in her collection, there's a lot of handwriting, but it's really, really good. So for those 2 things, I am extremely grateful. And now, as Stephen mentioned, we get to have a bit of a library detour, which I think is like a regular road trip, but better researched. So starting here in this building, we have the state's oldest library, and we have a very wide definition of researcher, so everyone's welcome. You do need an appointment. There's only 2 of us that work there, but you can come for no other reason that you just want to. So please shoot us an email. Please come by. Please come look at stuff. Once you get us started talking, it's very hard to get us to stop. But we are making great strides with digitization, and especially with this topic and this talk. I did almost 1,000 pages in a day, which was a long day, but we have so much more to digitize. We are getting our platform ready. We're doing the batch upload, like we're doing some of the pilot uploads right now, but not everything is digitized, even with our best efforts. So I got to use a bona fide card catalog when I was researching this topic, and that was fantastic. It was very exciting. So we have some unbelievable collections. No one's seen them before. They're really, really lovely. One of them that we just got in was the Amelia McPhee archival collection we got from one of her nephews. It is unprocessed. She was the chief instructor for the Couriers. And we also have some audio from one of the artists who worked at the Hopi House, and it's phenomenal. Downstairs in the photo archives, my colleagues are downstairs, we have a collection from Hunter Clarkson's sister-in-law, Jim's wife. It's almost 500 photos. No one's seen. They're almost all digitized. They're not quite up yet. And I used those in this presentation. And they're really, really beautiful. The lantern slides, all those really lovely hand-colored ones, are all in this collection as well. Down the street at the State Records Center and Archives, there are a number of collections, including Verona Konopak. She's the one second in from the left. There are also two from Hunter Clarkson, one documents, one photos. He also had sort of a loose relationship with making his scrapbook, both with citations and with glue. So his scrapbook is loose in many, many senses of the word. But it's really quite fun. So if you have a chance and want to go sort of see the detours from his perspective, those are down the road. Some of the most amazing collections, bar none, are down at UNM Center for Southwest Research. Erna Ferguson is in the top right. You can possibly see why some people refer to her as Sterna. Her collection is very extensive, and at one point they renumbered, so getting the right stuff can take a minute. The staff are wonderful, and they will help you, but sometimes scrapbook 75, there are somehow two of them, and now one of them scrapbook 36, and then you have to ask a couple of times. They're very patient, but it may take a minute. And then in the bottom left is Elizabeth DeHuff, and her collection is just unbelievably stunning. She was the main presenter at the LaFonda's Lecture Lounge, and she gave 3 to 6 lectures per week for 15 years. I know. Her notes are at UNM, so like the original drawings that she did from Pueblo pottery, like all of these originals, and she was the main entertainment in town. So when people would come to town, they would come to her talk just for entertainment. And she would illustrate the slides with the lanterns, her talks with the lantern slides you've seen today. So that's what she would see. There's also audio of her. And so it's been digitized as well. It's fantastic. Her anthropological work is not only groundbreaking, but it was foundational for the Anglo scholars who came behind her. And amazingly, she got her mother to send her letters back. So you can just read the letters to her mom, and they're unbelievable. At Albuquerque Public, Terry is here somewhere. She's back in the back. She's one of the librarians. They finally have a collection that's about Erna Ferguson and not just from Erna Ferguson, which is extremely helpful. And it's also a really lovely building, it's the original Albuquerque Public Library at Edith and Central, and has the center for the book. And then down in Belen is the Harvey House Museum. And right now they have an exhibit on Charles Seary. I don't think the Searys are here this year. If you are, I do apologize. And they have some things in their collections that I haven't seen elsewhere. So we have a few sort of coming attractions that we weren't able to get to so far. In Tucson is Dr. Edward Dozier's collection. He was the only native driver. He was from Santa Clara. His collection is down there. He went on to be only the second native recipient of a PhD in anthropology. So his years with the Detours as a driver are just such a tiny part of his whole collection, but they are there. And there's a second collection for Verona Konopak. She's in Tucson as well. There are 500 lantern slides from the Santa Fe Railroad in Phoenix, and I believe Byron Harvey III's collections in Phoenix, and there are some also at NAU. So if you're driving around and just feel like you need to go to a library, as I'm sure you do just, frequently, here are some. And then to switch gears slightly to a coming attraction, Hunter Clarkson's granddaughter is here today. Maggie, do you want to give a wave? She's all the way in the back. And she's making a documentary on her family and their part in this whole thing, and working with members of the Taos Pueblo. And then Mike Butler, who I believe is on Zoom and is author of several books, including Tracking the Chile Line Railroad to Santa Fe, has a new book coming out at the beginning of 2024, which will be tracking Fred Harvey's Southwest Indian Detours, in which he traces what it's like to do them today. And the three of us will be presenting at the Historical Society of New Mexico's conference in Albuquerque at the end of April. So you could get all three of us at once. This is from Diane's notes. These are just some of the couriers. There are at least 52 couriers and administrative staff, and at least 55 drivers and mechanics. Their stories are out there and add so much richness and illustration to this story. There are so many more paths to explore that I hope we can all find ourselves on a little detour. Thank you.
When did the detours cease, and is there any thought today about bringing them back?
Technically in like the 60s. Well, okay, technically like the 80s. It depends on how you count them and in what variation and like what you think of as a detour. So there was the company tried to revive them after World War II, but the world had changed so much that it wasn't quite the same. I have a great article for you, I promise. It came out in the 80s. So, are there others?
I will say one thing. I think in reality, the one thing we always have to remember is that the Harvey Company innovated in these areas, and then other people did what they were doing. And in the case of the detours, the Harvey Company innovated something that was already happening, as Kathleen has already explained. So I think it's really clear. The Indian detours as we know them ended in the early 30s when Hunter Clarkson, after he took the company over, couldn't do it anymore. It doesn't mean that the materials that they created didn't continue to influence generations of tourism. But things end. And in this case, that's when that ended.
Real quick response about the detours. I want to give a shout out to Kathy Hendrickson, who's run the Southwest Detours out of Las Vegas and has done a very good job. So, yes, Kathy, thank you for continuing to be.
There she is. Give it. Yeah, give a big wave.
What's the April conference title again?
It will be I believe, 25th to 27th. It'll be at the Embassy Suites in Uptown.
Okay, and second, did the detours ever go out of the Alvarado?
No. Well, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. They were based in Santa Fe, but they would go out of elsewhere.
You probably know a lot more about this than I do, but have you been able to use Ellen Bradbury Reed as a resource and her
Not
former
yet.
company Recursos de Santa Fe?
Do you know her?
I can tell you about her.
Love to.
An academic perfection.
Oh, Oh,
from her.
fantastic. Thank you. Wonderful. Perfect.
Thank you, Kathleen.